Welcome to our second module on Racelighting. Chapter 1, Racial Microaggressions. In this module, we'll talk about the relationship between racial microaggressions and racelighting and how it serves to create a unique experience in the lives of BIPOC. In the previous module, we talked through the antecedents of the racelighting process, focusing on white supremacy, white nationalism, white fragility, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and capitalistic interests as cultural factors that inform bias that is in play within our society. We talked about two different types of bias, explicit bias and implicit bias. And now what we want to do is talk about the relationship between bias and microaggressions. So bias is the dispositions and attitudes and stereotypes that we hold within us. Microaggressions is the way in which we communicate that to one another. Microaggressions is a concept that was created by a Harvard scholar named Chester Pierce. He was a psychiatrist in the Harvard Medical Center. And he did research focusing on Black populations, trying to understand how the everyday mundane racism that they experience in their daily lives serves to impact them. And he found that ultimately it creates a situation where people feel like they are in a disenfranchised state and they feel immobilized to engage in planning and action that can make their lives and conditions better. And so he focused on the role that these indignities have, how microaggressions serve to impact the dignity of BIPOC. This brings us to the definition of microaggressions. Racial microaggressions, according to Daryl Wing Sue, are defined as brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. They are pervasive in that they are normal and commonplace and part of people's daily experiences. They are also put down, subtle snubs, and dismissive looks. Now, microaggressions as a concept has been significantly expanded by this scholar, Daryl Wing Sue, who's created a framework which talks about three different types of microaggressions: micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations, which were part of the previous slide. Now, what's important to know about microaggressions is that there can oftentimes be difficulty in understanding what message just occurred. And it's due to a concept called attributional ambiguity, which we'll get to a moment here. And what this concept looks at is the ways in which when we receive messages from one another, how it can serve to create a sense of haziness or lack of clarity in terms of what the real intent was. And because of this attributional ambiguity, microaggressions are oftentimes described as being more psychologically damaging than direct acts of racism. And partly that's because you can understand what a racist act is. If someone calls you the N-word, you know what to do with that. You know what that means. You know in terms of where that person stands in relationship with you. But when it comes to microaggressions, they're so subtle and beneath the surface, it's hard to determine what was the actual intent. And as a result, psychologists say that they can be more psychologically damaging than direct acts of racism because the accumulation of these events together creates an experience that is detrimental to people of color.
So now let's talk about the relationship between racial microaggressions and racelighting. So let's say that this is the totality of microaggressions, racial microaggressions, that are experienced within an organization. This is the totality of those messages. Now, not every message that is going to be received by an individual is going to be a racelighting message. So let's just assume that of that, this percentage here are messages that are racelighting messages, right? These are racelighting messages. So then you might ask yourself, how do you know the difference? The first thing to understand is that for most racelighting messages, they are microaggressions. But not all microaggressions are racelighting messages. These messages here are race-based messages that serve to sow doubt and disorientation among the racelighting, whether these messages are active race lighting or passive race lighting, they are still messages that serve to make the recipient doubt themselves, their memories, their recollections, and their basic humanity. In contrast, you can have microaggressions within an environment that are not race lighting messages. These messages are microaggressions. They're subtle slights, they're subtle snubs, they're insults, but they don't necessarily make the recipient feel this overwhelming sense of doubt and disorientation. They don't make the recipient feel as if they are losing themselves, as if they are losing their mind, as if they are coming delusional. So we want to distinguish between the fact that you can have a racial microaggression that is not a race lighting message, and you can have a racial microaggression that sows doubt and disorientation among the recipient, and now that makes it a race lighting message.
Now, with microaggressions, it's not about what's said. It's about what's really said. So it's not about what's said. It's about what's really said. Now, what's said is to someone of color with a sense of surprise, oh, wow, you're so articulate. But what's really said is, I didn't think that you would be. What's said to a person of color on campus at nighttime when they're asked for their ID is, can I see your ID? But what's really said is, I think you're here to steal something. So what's said and what's really said are oftentimes two very different messages that are communicated to individuals. And so what's really said in these micro messages that have two meanings are what's on your screen. You're different from us. You don't belong here. You're not intelligent or capable. People of color are lazy and they don't care. Your experiences and perceptions are wrong. You're being too sensitive, you're criminal, you're dangerous, you're deviant, you're up to no good. Racism does not exist. You are not a person of worth. These are the messages that are said to the individuals that we serve. Now, microaggressions are broken down into three different primary types. The first, which is not featured on your screen, is what is called a micro assault. A micro assault is really viewed, according to Daryl Wing Sue, as good old-fashioned racism. It's calling someone the N-word, or a racial epithet, or the imagery of a noose or a swastika, or purposely engaging in acts to communicate to someone that they do not belong in an environment. These are acts that are intentionally racist and are engaged to demonstrate that ideology. There's also what are called micro insults. Now, unlike micro assaults, micro insults are more often unconscious, meaning the person is unaware that they're communicating these messages to another person. One that we'll look at today is called an ascription of intelligence, which is when we assume that people of color have academic capabilities that are lower than that of their peers, or more specifically, according to Daryl Wing Sue's definition, that we have any attribution of positive or negative towards one's intelligence based upon their race. Either way, we know that the underlying assumptions when we're talking about Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students is that they are academically inferior. The second is an assumption of criminality, where we assume that students, based upon their backgrounds and races, are dangerous, deviant, up to no good, have some sort of malintent, will cut corners. And the third is second-class citizenship, when we assume that a person and we treat a person as lesser than because we assume that they are lesser than in some sort of way that justifies mistreatment in our mind. Now, what we see in the work that we do is that the combination of the first three items, ascriptions of intelligence, assumptions of criminality, and second-class citizenship, create a unique experience and are the most recurrent microaggressions for many of our students of color. And we refer to these collectively as the D3 effect: distrust, assumptions of criminality; disdain, second-class citizenship; and disregard, ascriptions of intelligence. And so we see those as the three primary types that face our students, and we'll talk about what that looks like in this section. We also want to highlight just briefly some of the other microaggressions that are listed here on your screen. Microaggressions can include different norming. This occurs when we make a statement about a person of color that separates them from their community, typically by drawing down their community and extolling that person of color. And we learned about this one first through the research on middle school students, where you would have a teacher who would identify a young child. Let's say that the young child is Latina, and she would have a sense of affinity for this child, but not usually children who come from her community. And so they would need to essentialize her or make her different in some sort of way. And so they would say to the child, you know, you're wonderful, you're capable. Why can't the others be more like you? Or you work hard, you're committed. Why can't others have that same level of work ethic? And it's a message that tears down the community while, again, raising up the person who is the target of that message. Another example is what is called color blindness on the right-hand side of your screen. This is when we make statements that assume that we do not see color. So if someone says in a situation where race or racism comes up, I don't see color, or why are we talking about color or bringing it into this situation? Why don't we treat everyone the same? America is a melting pot. I don't see color. We're all one race, the human race. Those types of statements are oftentimes trying to express a notion that we want to see people who are different from us as being worthy of trust, worthy of humanity, worthy of dignity. That is what is oftentimes in the person's mind that they're actually saying. But instead, what they're saying is, I don't see color, which suggests a different message, which is, I don't see you. I don't see the uniqueness that you bring to the situation. For a person who their racial ethnic background is something that is important to them, as something that serves as a source of pride, when you say that you don't see color, oftentimes you're saying that you don't see them. A myth of meritocracy is another one that's very common. And this is when we make statements that assume that the people who work the hardest are those who are going to do the best. The people who work the hardest are those who are going to do the best. And it takes away an acknowledgement of context, that people engage in our society with different advantages and also different barriers in their way, and that not everyone has the same level playing field that others do. And so when we make this assumption that the people who work the hardest are the ones that get the most, it doesn't take into account the fact that you can work really hard and still not get the same level of opportunity based upon your racial ethnic background. And then the last one we'd highlight is denial of individual racism. And this is when someone could bring up an issue of race or racism and bring it to the attention of somebody who may have harmed them or may have been aware of the harm. And the response from that individual is to deny that that incident took place or that that person is understanding the situation. This is important because this denial of individual racism will come up in terms of our framework, in terms of how we think about some messages that serve to lead to Racelighting even more so than others. And this is one of them. So let's go to our first microaggression example, ascriptions of intelligence. Ascriptions of intelligence, according to Daryl Wing Sue, is assigning a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on their race. So based upon their race, their racial ethnic affiliation, we view a person and their intelligence as associated with that race. And so for some communities, this can mean that they are viewed as being academically inferior or incapable. And there's a lot of research that has shown that Black, Native, and Latinx communities are particularly prone to these ascriptions of intelligence, which assume that they are incapable of doing the work. Here are some examples of what we've seen this look like in our own research. One is an example where a student said, the teacher called me a week after I submitted my paper. She said, I read your paper. Wow, you wrote this? They were shocked that I could write. Another example, in my Zoom breakout group, I answered a question. Then one of the boys in the class said, you're smart for a Black girl. The qualifier being they were smart for their racial, ethnic, and gender group. When I give out ideas, they ignore me like I don't exist or like my ideas are bad. I'm the only person of color in the gifted and talented program. So not being viewed as being able to incorporate within a group and be able to contribute to the conversation because of your racial ethnic background. And another example, a student said, I asked a question and he responded by speaking extra slow and exaggerating his pronunciation, like I don't speak English or something because I'm Filipina. He obviously doesn't think I'm smart. And so we can see how this can play out even in perceptions around language and national affiliation. Another common example that we see is what is referred to as an assumption of criminality, where we make assumptions that a person of color is dangerous, deviant, up to no good, criminal, has some sort of malintent. This is a very common one for boys of color, particularly Black and Native boys, who are significantly overrepresented in those who are exposed to suspensions and expulsions in high schools and in K-12 education in general. And so this assumption of criminality is a notion that is oftentimes associated with that. Here are some examples. I wrote the teacher to let him know I wasn't able to attend class because my internet was down. He wrote back very angrily, insinuating that I was lying. The student exclaimed, "Lots of people are having internet problems right now," with the essential communication from the student of, "Why are they picking on me?" Another student said, "I was in a virtual breakout room with my teacher. He said Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their papers than others. It's not that they're not smart. They aren't smart. They just don't understand the language." So this assumption that Latinx students were more likely to cheat because of perceptions of language barriers, really two microaggressions in one. Now, we have collected data. When I say we, I mean myself and my colleague, Dr. Idara Essian, who is also at San Diego State University with my colleague, Frank Harris. We have collected narratives from over 1,000 parents of Black children, asking them about the experiences that they and their children have in early childhood education, the earliest levels of schooling from preschool through 3rd grade. And from these over 1,000 narratives, we have found that there are 6 primary themes that really serve to explain the ways in which an assumption of criminality plays out for Black children in early learning. The first is that they are assumed to be troublemakers. If there is a problem, they are assumed to be the locus of that problem. They're assumed to be, again, dangerous, deviant, up to no good. And as a result, they are then labeled with terms such as bad, physical, hyper, aggressive, defiant. Because they're assumed to be the problem and they're labeled with these terms, educators are then more prone to following them with their intentional gaze. So they spend more time watching this student for problematic behavior because they assume that there's going to be a problem. So they hyper surveil them for wrongdoing. And even if they engage in actions that are similar to that of their peers, they are oftentimes received in a different way. Their actions are perceived to be more prone to criminality, and so therefore they are singled out for discipline even when they engage in the same actions as their peers. An example of this could be you have 4 boys in kindergarten and they're throwing rocks against the fence. Now, should they be throwing rocks against the fence? No, but it's age-appropriate behavior for a child in kindergarten. A teacher comes out and they see this incident occurs and they single out the one Black child in the group as an example of what not to be, how not to act, and how not to learn. We'll come back to other examples of this later on. They're then subject to harsher punishments. They're more prone to suspensions as opposed to loss of recess. They're more prone to expulsions as opposed to suspensions. They're always prone to disciplinary actions that are elevated. So a non-Black child may get yelled at. A Black child will lose their recess. A non-Black child will lose their recess. The Black child will be sent to the principal's office. A non-Black child will be sent to the principal's office. The Black child will be suspended. It's always an elevated level of suspension. And then they're also viewed through a disorder-based lens where they're assumed to have some sort of underlying condition that results in the outcome disparities that are evident. And on your screen are examples of the first thing where they are assumed to be troublemakers. We provide these examples in early learning because they serve to show how these patterns continue to evolve and to reify themselves over time in the experiences of the IPOC. So one parent said, "I have seen the assistant teacher going into a verbal battle with my son, as my son was trying to explain the situation. The teacher said, well, the other kid said you started it and took his word for it without even trying to hear my son." Another parent said, on the bottom hand side of your screen, "My child has never had an accident since being potty trained. They were sent out to timeout and he wet himself. He told me he didn't tell the teacher he had to go, but she most likely assumed he was lying. When confronted about this, she didn't even mention that he was in timeout, essentially lying on him." Other examples of this we can see on the subsequent screen. Let's go with the first example. "My son's teacher told me she had moved him to a table up front. It was where she moved the children that had difficulty paying attention or behaving. My son was getting distracted in class. When I came to visit, that front table was entirely populated by Black boys. I immediately demanded that he be moved. When we think about being labeled with terms as bad, physical, hyper, aggressive, defiant, the other examples on the screen serve to show some of the common phrases that are used to talk about children of color. Let's go with the second and third examples. The teacher repeatedly described my 7-year-old child as aggressive because he put his all into winning at sports and games. I had to interject numerous times telling the teacher, reminding the teacher that my child is competitive, not aggressive. Another parent said, ever since my child has been about 2 to 3 years old, she's been referred to as aggressive, destructive, defiant, deregulated, hyperactive, distracted, and has been more closely watched than her peers. We also know that young children are then more likely to be watched for wrongdoing because they're assumed to be troublemakers and labeled with these terms. Here's an example on your screen. I would also witness them constantly watching my son. When I brought it up, they denied it. I explained that of course they would see him doing more things if they were always watching him. I witnessed other children doing the same things and no one would even engage them. He was the only Black kid in school. Another parent said, I volunteered in my preschool classroom. The teacher approached me and tells me, you need to watch out for Jamal. He held the scissors the other day and started swinging it at the other students. The teacher made it seem that Jamal was a villain or criminal for pretending to use the scissors incorrectly. While she was saying, watch out, Johnny, a white boy in the class, held the same scissors and did the same thing. She responded very kindly and then carried on. The notion is that the treatment was different. And then as a result, they can also then be singled out for discipline. I gave you the example of 4 boys throwing rocks against the fence. Here's another similar example, 3 down from the top. An incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed out a rainbow, and about 3 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. He can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out, when 4 of the kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair. We also know that Black children are subject to harsher punishments. I gave examples earlier of if a child is losing recess, then Black children are oftentimes being suspended. So it's an elevated level of mistreatment. Here are some examples of being subject to harsher punishments when Black children are subject to disciplinary actions that are disproportionate in comparison to their peers. The first parent said, when he's disciplined, it seems harsher and more stern than his non-colored counterparts who participated in the same events. There appears to be some fear from the administration. They see through the lens that he's a danger. Another parent said, if we look at the example second from the top, my son's first grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe for even a small thing and didn't match the crime, such as turning around in his seat one time would result in the whole day being marked as bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. Another example is at the bottom hand side of your screen, and this is what happens when harsher disciplinary action transitions from that to mistreatment. The teachers have the apples of their eye, and my children being Black fall in the lesser. But his teacher yells at my son for the smallest things. My son told me one time he made him cry. He's insensitive, saying racial stuff like boy this, boy that, stand in the corner. The third example down also demonstrates the same pattern. My child was in 2nd grade and he made a joke. His teacher yelled at him and made him cry and said 2nd grade is no place for jokes. She then made him stand in front of the class, and the teacher and her associate continued to yell at him and call him a clown, a class clown. He continued to cry and they continued to yell at him. And then the last example is being viewed through a disorder-based lens. And this is when Black children are assumed to be emotionally, behaviorally disturbed, ADHD, or to have some sort of underlying health issue that results in the perceptions of their proneness to criminality. So these are the 6 patterns that we see Now, we share these patterns because these are evident in the earliest levels of schooling in terms of how mistreatment is manifested in the lives and experiences of Black children. We have to think about the accumulation of these messages over time and how they serve to impact the psychological disposition of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are impacted by these messages. In addition to an ascription of intelligence and an assumption of criminality, we also know that second-class citizenship is a very common microaggression experience by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Second-class citizenship occurs when a white person is given preferential treatment over a person of color. Examples of this from the research literature from Baker include responding to discussion posts from white male students and ignoring posts from students of color. Another example is written on your screen. You have to raise your virtual hand in Zoom to get called on, but it feels like she never calls on me and the other Latinos. It's like we don't exist. So it's when students of color or people of color in general are treated as lesser than, as second class. This notion of being lesser than that is combined with pathologizing of culture creates a unique experience for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the last example that we'd like to provide to you is this notion of pathologizing culture. When we assume that the values and communication styles of dominant white cultural groups are ideal in comparison to others. And we can see this through, again, these notions of stereotypes and deficit notions around children of color, notions that suggest that they're lazy, that they don't care, that they're not really there for school, that they're coming from bad communities and bad schools, that they have some sort of they have something that is wrong with them. And ultimately, these stereotypes are evident in the experiences that we see. One person said, "So I logged on to the online meeting with my teacher. I asked a question, and his response was, well, did you do the readings?" The assumption was the student didn't, because the assumption was that they didn't because of the community that they came from. Another one is, I was talking with my counselor and I said I live in Mexico. She responded condescendingly saying, "Oh, you're a transborder student," as if that explained why I was struggling when it had nothing to do with me being a transborder student. This is something we see commonly in the Southwestern United States. Another example, in the Zoom breakout room, someone wrote, "If Black and Latinos made healthier choices about what they eat and stopped drinking and smoking, then so many of them wouldn't be dying from COVID-19. So these are all examples of racial microaggressions. Now, what we'd like to do is to turn to the relationship between these messages and race-lighting. Now, again, race-lighting is what happens when gaslighting is racial. And ultimately, microaggressions lead to an attributional ambiguity. And so we're going to explore that next.
Let's talk about a concept that is directly associated with race-lighting, and that is the concept of attributional ambiguity. Attributional ambiguity. So attributional ambiguity, according to Daryl Wing Su, is a term that has been given to motivational uncertainty, in that the motives and meanings of a person's action are unclear and hazy. He says that studies suggest that attributional ambiguity depletes psychological energy by diverting attention away from other important tasks, such as problem solving in classrooms and work productivity in the workplace. So attribution ambiguity, a lack of clarity or haziness in terms of what is taking place, what just happened, what is going on, how do I attribute what just occurred? So for some of you, you may know that I had the pleasure of growing up in far Northern California in one of the most amazing towns that there is, called McLeod, California, a small town nestled at the base of Mount Shasta. And like all towns in America, McLeod was not immune to issues of race and racism. And so for me and my twin brother, I have an identical twin brother, we grew up in an environment where we were the only individuals of Black and African American descent in our classes and oftentimes in our entire school. And as a result, in my early experiences in school, from the time I was in kindergarten to the time I was in 5th or 6th grade, it was very, very recurrent. It was often that I would be called a word like the N-word, or a cottonhead, or another racial epithet, which was meant to send a message to me and to my brother about what our perceived space and place was in that environment. Now, there was no ambiguity in what that message was meant to convey. There was no ambiguity at all, because as a young child, when someone calls you the N-word, you know what that is, right? You know what box to put that in. You know how to then look at that box and examine it. That's racism. That goes in the racism box. And then as a result, you also can then feel more empowered to be able to respond to what occurs. So if someone, for example, called me the N-word, I knew what that was. That was racism. And I knew that that was someone who I didn't want to associate myself with. So if I'm making a list for a birthday party, they're not coming to the birthday party. If I'm getting ready to invite some friends to come over after school, I'm not inviting them. Why? Because there was no lack of clarity. There was no haziness in the message. I knew what they were trying to convey to me. But then as I got older, the messages themselves became more subtle, more refined. It would be someone who would say to me with a sense of surprise, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to know that." And that message was one where I was trying to interpret what was being said. Were they saying that I was well-spoken? But that with that sense of surprise, it made me feel different. It made me feel as if they were saying that they were surprised that I was well-spoken. But it was hazy. It was unclear. There was an attributional ambiguity, a lack of clarity about the intent. And as a result, I didn't know how to place that message. Was that in the racism box? Was that in a different box? Was it me? Was I being too sensitive? Was I not understanding? And that's that attribution ambiguity that serves as the doorway into the race-lighting experience, where then one can be left to second guess themselves.